Do you think we could be going into double-digit inflation? Could we go into 15% inflation?
So I think the official numbers, so next month, using that specific time frame, next month or two, I don't think you'll see a gigantic gap, because if you look at the way the calculation works, a very big chunk of it is actually home, right? So there's owner's equivalent rent, and things like healthcare, right? So those are unlikely to change rapidly in a month. If anything, we're seeing kind of home prices sort of kind of level out to some extent. They're cooling off compared to what they were doing over the past 2 years. And so there's a big chunk of the CPI index that won't change much. Now, the part that is going to change a lot is the food and the energy, right? So that's the part that's going to be, spiking up by double-digit percentages. And that's where everyone kind of has their own unique inflation basket. So the official CPI number, it'll be hot, but it might not be as high as you think. But then, for example, let's say your house is paid off and you have a pretty tight monthly budget. Maybe you're living on fixed income, for example. So obviously a big chunk of what you spend on goes towards food and energy. So someone in that situation, their effective inflation rate would be double digits. And so I think the quote unquote real numbers will be, at least in the low double digits. I wouldn't expect to see the official numbers show double digits right away. But if, the longer this goes on, you could hit double-digit official CPI in the U.S.
This is something Eric Weinstein talked to me about. He said having an official CPI figure is actually mainly useless for most people. Actually, people need a way of being able to calculate their own personal inflation numbers. I'm not sure if that's something that's particularly possible, but I think you're kind of alluding to the same point there.
Basically, yeah. There's no. So inflation's kind of an arbitrary basket. What they do is they kind of take a sample of what the average household uses. So what percentage of their expenses go towards housing? What percentage of their expenses go towards medical care? What expenses goes towards transportation? And they kind of formed this, this quote unquote average basket, and then they track over time what happened to the inflation of that basket. But then it's further tricky, because instead of doing home prices, they do like owner's equivalent rent, and they also do hedonic adjustments. So they basically, if things get better over time, like if a car gets better than it was 5 years ago, even if the price doubles, they'll say, well, it kind of stayed the same, because sure, it doubled, but it got better. And they'll also do replacements. So for example, if a prime cut of meat goes up in price, they'll assume that you rotate it to a lower quality or lower price cut of meat. And so there are kind of ways to smooth out and lower that number compared to what, if you just look at a raw number, if you just kind of pick something like what are bacon prices doing over a long period of time, generally you'll see that prices like that are a little bit higher than what the CPI basket's saying, because you don't have those hedonic adjustments, you don't have those kind of replacement things kicking in.
Right, so for anyone listening rather than watching the video, as Lyn explained that they have a way of smoothing out this number, she had a wry smile across her face, a little grin. I mean, you're basically saying it's kind of manipulative.
Well, yeah, every change they've done to the CPI index has been lowering it, right? So it's not like they say, okay, we wanted to make this more accurate, and this will actually this will state inflation's a little higher than we were previously saying. No, that never happens. It's always every change they make to it is, well, it's actually a little lower because if you take into account X, Y, Z, and so you do get this understated level. Now, there's still informational value in the CPI index, but you have to know what you're looking at and break out certain things from it if you really want to go into the specifics, because you do have this kind of artificially constructed basket with hedonic adjustments. And again, hedonic adjustments, they seem to go one direction. So a lot of services got lower quality over the past couple of years, right? So flying is less pleasant than it was before, and it was already unpleasant, right? So, but are they having negative hedonic adjustments in terms of flying? No, of course not. So no. It's like, hedonic adjustments and ways that they recalculate the index generally only point towards ways to try to understate it to some degree.
So this transitory period that we've been sold is seems to be going on a bit longer than I think they expected. And I'm going to assume you're not agreeing with any of these mainstream articles that have been coming out recently trying to explain to us why inflation is good for us.
No, I don't believe inflation's good. And it was kind of in some ways I viewed it as inevitable at this point, right? So with
Yeah.
so much debt in the system, there's almost nothing that's going to happen other than trying to inflate the way out of it. So it's not surprising. I think, if you would have asked me 2 years ago when I was calling for inflation, would I expect it to be almost 8% officially? Probably not, right? So even as someone in the inflationary side, this has been a stronger inflation surge than I would have guessed. Obviously, war is adding to that now, but even before the war, this was already just in place. And so basically, when you have the combination of a rapid expansion in the money supply with various constraints, so supply chain constraints, commodity constraints, labor constraints, any sort of constraint, you're going to get price inflation.
Well, do you know what one of the weird side effects of this is that even with this business that I do, we have contracts. We have advertising contracts, and some of them are multi-year. And when me and Danny went to get coffee earlier, I was saying to him, do you know what? We probably actually need to have an inflation clause within the contract. Is that something that, I guess what I'm getting at is like I thought of this just now. It's something I just thought, shit, I should really be considering this. Is that something that's like generally considered, or do you think that's something a lot of people are considering, like myself, as a new clause they need?
So in some of the longest term contracts, it's pretty common to have inflation components. And so, for example, if you operate like a pipeline, for example, and you're regulated for like what you can charge, usually they will have inflation components. The same thing would be true for long-term leases for real estate. They often do have an inflation component. And it's because when you expect to operate a contract for years and decades, you start to take it into account. Now, often shorter term, 2, 3, 4, 5 year contracts, often those, won't have those type of things. And so one of the challenges in inflationary environments is that there's just more frictions in terms of doing business because, when prices aren't stable, it's hard to do long-term planning, and it's hard to structure contracts. It's hard to determine how much you're going to pay your input providers because you don't even know what you're going to be able to charge your customers, right? So there are some companies that have they naturally have quick turnover, right? An example would be like a toll road, right? There are just people driving through paying all the time. Whereas if you build something, right, you order raw materials, you make these contracts come in, you hold some inventory, it might be a 6-month turnaround until that's a finished product, right? And so if you kind of contracted your selling prices and you didn't have the same duration on your input prices, you could do all this work and then not make a profit because you got your profit margin was 5%, and that got kind of deleted by inflation, for example. On the other hand, if they structure it very well, they can benefit from it. They can be like, well, we managed to have long duration input costs, and we managed to have adjustable selling prices, and so we did great in inflation. So that's where investors have to be careful about things they invest in, because they try to find ones that can adjust their revenue faster than they while having a lot of fixed costs for their inputs. And so, but just in general, from an economic standpoint, it's a more challenging operating environment for most types of companies when you have unclear inflation and pretty high inflation.
And what are the wider economic risks right now? I was speaking with Nick Carter the other day, and he said humans flourish at a time of low commodity prices. With high commodity prices, this brings a lot of economic risk into the system. What are the kind of like more second order effects that maybe someone like I might not consider, or somebody listening to this show might not consider?
Well, one would be the risks of political upheaval, right? As we talked about, when people, especially in developing countries, but this also can impact developed countries. So they take generally different forms. So if you're a presidential administration in a developed country and you have high inflation, you're much less likely to win re-election. And if it's in developing countries, you're more likely to have just outright protests and revolution. Another thing is that it can contribute to a recession, because people have to spend more of their money on gasoline, on electricity, on food, and then therefore they can buy fewer iPhones. So they delay their phone upgrade cycle. They delay other purchases. They might skip a vacation, right? So if their necessary input costs go up, they have to cut down on discretionary costs. And so that's how you can get a recession. And that's why when you have, you can have a stagflationary recession where commodity prices are high. Basically, the 70s would be a key example. So high commodity prices, but you'd go through periods of severe economic softness because people are getting squeezed in their pocketbooks.
And can you point to any historical examples where we've been through similar times, and some of maybe your predictions of what could happen and how we may come out of this situation?
So the three closest decades would be the 2000s, the 1970s, and the 1940s. Those were generally the inflationary commodity boom decades. And obviously they had very different magnitudes. So the 2000s were considered a rather favorable decade. And part of why you had a commodity boom is that you had the rise of the quote unquote BRIC nations. So Brazil, Russia, India, China. You had a dollar weakness. And so that contributed to an emerging market boom. And they had a rapid increase in their commodity consumption at a time when commodity supplies were rather constrained. And so you had a big uptick in commodity prices, but it was generally for the most part a good thing, right? It was kind of not that those price increases were good, but that it was happening for rather good reasons. A lot, the world was in some ways booming. Now that eventually turned into the subprime mortgage crisis, and that also, high oil prices contribute to the recession we eventually had in 2008. And so by the end of that period, it was negative. But overall, that's kind of in some cases the best example you can think of. Another, the one prior to that, the big commodity boom before that would be the 70s, and that's where you had severe supply constraints because. So the United States found oil in the kind of the second half of the 1800s. We had almost a century of just constant increase in our annual oil production. Occasional, you dip, but it was a structural increase. And that peaked in 1970. So in 1970, U.S. oil production peaked and started to roll over structurally. At the same time as baby boomers across the world, including the U.S., were coming into home buying years. And so you had basically a lot of commodity demand, and you had limited commodity supply. So the United States became more reliant on Middle Eastern oil. And so that opened up all sorts of geopolitical conflicts and shortages and inflation. And so that was a big issue. Now that part of why we had low commodity prices recently is because the U.S.'s structural decline in energy production reversed because of shale. So we added a lot of new energy to the world. That seems like it's probably behind us. Like we're still obviously producing a lot of shale, but we're not kind of rapidly increasing our shale production. We're kind of, maybe not at the limits, but we're closer to the limits in terms of how much annual oil production we can produce. But anyway, so you had 2000s, you had the 1970s, and if you go back before then, I've been using the 1940s as my closest macro comparison in terms of fiscal monetary policy. Kind of the reasons for inflation were more, in the 70s, the inflation was bank lending driven. You had demographics boom, and then of course fiscal added fuel to the fire. You had the guns and butter program, and you had Vietnam War. But a lot of that inflation was bank lending driven. In the 40s, a lot of it was purely war spending. So banks were not lending much. People had hardship. And a lot of the inflation and commodity price spikes you saw were obviously because of fiscal stimulus to support the war effort, right? So, and so that was a very big year for commodities, and you had price controls, you had wage controls, you had kind of shortages. People had to substitute things. They're even, they would literally change what physical coins are made of to try to conserve, more important commodities. That's how extreme it gets in some of those decades. And so I do think we're going into, I've already been in the commodity bull market camp for the 2020s. And if we're going to have outright war, I've been using the 40s comparison. I always kind of say, hopefully there won't be the kinetic war. But now if we're actually moving into the kinetic war, then it's unfortunately even closer to the 1940s because you have those geopolitically driven commodity shortages.